This video is best enjoyed during lunch, dinner, before bed, or when you need something in the background while studying or working. Now let's get started. Saturday afternoon, sunlight streamed through the lush green canopy, creating dancing patches of light on the brick-paved street of the small neighborhood. Lena skipped along, her tiny hand firmly entwined with her mother's, her face beaming with excitement, eyes sparkling. Today was a special day. The charity fair was being held at the town's largest market, and her mother had promised to take her as a reward for being good this week and helping with household chores. Lena had been excited since early morning, choosing her favorite yellow dress, wearing her cute little sneakers, and neatly braiding her hair to look tidy. The fair not only had stalls selling handicrafts, sweets, and games, but also had a special area for abandoned animals waiting to be adopted.
Mom, can I see the puppies?
Lena bounced on her small feet, her voice ringing with excitement. Amanda laughed.
Of course. But first, would you like something to eat? There's waffles with fresh cream.
Lena nodded eagerly. The aroma of baked goods filled the air, mingling with the sweet scent of cinnamon and caramel. The vendor was frying waffles on a hot pan, each layer of golden brown batter turning crispy, topped with a snow-white dusting of powdered sugar. While waiting for her mother to buy the waffles, Lena looked around. The stalls displayed all kinds of items, colorful handmade bracelets, bottles of gently scented herbal perfumes, and tiny wooden toys intricately carved. Everything was interesting, but Lena couldn't help but anticipate the area with the abandoned dogs. After receiving the warm waffle from her mother, she took a crispy bite while pulling her mother's hand to walk faster.
I want to see the puppies right now.
Amanda laughed but allowed her daughter to lead the way. But instead of heading straight to the dog adoption area as planned, Lena suddenly stopped, her eyes drawn to a dark corner beside a vegetable stall. There a small figure was huddled, chained tightly to an old wooden post. A dog. It was so thin that each rib was clearly visible. Its jet black fur was caked with mud, covered in dirt, looking as if it had been forgotten in the rain and wind for too long. What stunned Lena wasn't its miserable appearance, but its eyes. Those eyes weren't just the gaze of an abandoned animal. They contained a profound sadness, an endless resignation. But at the same time, deep within that gaze, there remained a fragile glimmer of hope, as if it was still waiting for someone to come and rescue it from the darkness where it had been trapped for so long. Lena swallowed hard, her heart feeling constricted. She didn't understand why she couldn't look away from that dog. She only knew that somehow she could feel its pain.
Lena, what's wrong?
Amanda asked, noticing her daughter suddenly standing motionless.
Dog!
Lena whispered. Amanda looked in the direction of her daughter's gaze. When she saw Midnight, she slightly furrowed her brow. Just then, a hoarse, gruff voice rang out.
What are you looking at it for, kid?
Lena startled and turned around. A middle-aged man with messy hair, scruffy beard, wearing an old worn shirt stood nearby, holding a sack of vegetables he had just unloaded from a cart.
It's useless,
he sneered.
I'm about to throw it away to make space.
Lena's eyes widened, her hands gripping the hem of her dress tightly.
Throw it away?
She couldn't believe what she had just heard.
Why would you do that?
Her voice trembled with anger. The man shrugged, smirking.
What kind of dog doesn't know how to bark, can't even guard the house? And it's as timid as a puppy, cowering whenever it sees people. Keeping it is pointless.
Midnight, hearing his voice, shrank back, ears flattened, even trembling. Lena couldn't bear it anymore. She stepped closer to Midnight, bent down, and carefully extended her hand. Immediately, Midnight flinched, backing away slightly. Its eyes opened wide, alert, as if expecting a blow to fall at any moment. Lena didn't rush. She said nothing, just quietly sat down, opening her palm in front of it, letting Midnight decide whether to come closer or not. The wind blew gently through the market, stirring a few dry leaves at the girl's feet. All sounds became muffled. The voices of vendors, the creaking of cart wheels, the barking of other dogs in the adoption area. Only Lena and Midnight remained. The girl sat still, patiently waiting. A moment passed. Midnight slowly lowered its head, gently sniffing the girl's hand. Lena held her breath. Then, Midnight softly nuzzled its head against her hand as a gesture of acceptance. Lena felt her heart tighten with emotion. At that moment, she knew she couldn't leave Midnight behind. Lena hugged Midnight tightly, feeling every tremble of its body, but she didn't let go. Her heart beat fast, not from fear, but from anger and compassion. Midnight didn't deserve to be treated this way. Amanda sighed, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Lena, listen to me. I understand you care for it, but don't you think there are other dogs that need you more?" Lena looked up, her eyes glistening.
But Mom, Midnight needs me too.
Amanda gently shook her head.
There are many other dogs in the adoption area. They're healthy, clean, and happy. You could choose a good puppy that's ready to be loved instead of an injured dog that might never trust you.
Lena bit her lip, turning back to look at Midnight. It was still trembling, huddled up, its eyes still filled with fear. But there was one thing Lena was certain of. Midnight didn't want to be here. The girl clenched her fists.
But I don't want another dog. I want this one.
Amanda let out a soft sigh, pondered for a moment, then said,
Lena, I'll give you one chance. Let's go to the adoption area and look first. If you still want this dog, we'll come back.
Lena felt her heart grow heavy, but she nodded. Part of her didn't want to leave at all. But she knew if she was stubborn right now, her mother might not agree with her decision. She turned around, walking away with her mother, but with each step away from Midnight, her heart felt heavier. The adoption area wasn't far away. Unlike the dark corner where Midnight was chained, this place was bright, clean, and filled with happy barking. Dogs in small kennels, eyes shining, tails wagging excitedly, eager when people approached. A volunteer smiled when she saw Lena.
Hello there. Are you looking for a new friend?
Lena nodded weakly, but her eyes weren't focused. Her mother pointed to a golden-haired dog with big, round, adorable eyes.
Lena, look, this one seems very friendly.
The dog wagged its tail, jumping up excitedly when Lena approached. The shelter staff smiled.
This one loves children. Would you like to try playing with it?
Lena reluctantly reached out her hand, letting the small dog sniff it. It licked her hand gently, tail wagging happily, clearly delighted. But Lena felt nothing. She looked down, then turned her head away, her mind not here at all. The image of Midnight appeared in her mind again. Its jet black, dirty fur, skinny frame, and those eyes full of pain, but still holding a fragile glimmer of hope. Midnight didn't bark, didn't wag its tail excitedly. It just waited, waiting for someone to save it. Lena couldn't stand it anymore. She stepped back, shaking her head firmly.
No.
Amanda looked at her daughter, somewhat surprised.
What's wrong, honey?
Lena looked up, her eyes full of determination.
Mom, I don't want another dog. I want Midnight.
Amanda pursed her lips, looking at her daughter. She knew Lena was a good girl, but once she had decided on something, no one could change her mind. She took a deep breath.
Are you sure?
Absolutely.
Lena didn't hesitate. Amanda was silent for a moment, then she gently took her daughter's hand.
All right, let's go back.
Lena ran quickly to the market corner where Midnight was still chained. But as soon as she arrived, the scene before her eyes made her heart clench. The vendor was raising his foot, preparing to kick Midnight again.
Stop!
Lena shouted. The man, startled, stopped and stared at her.
What's this, little girl?
Lena ran up, standing in front of Midnight, her eyes red with anger. Amanda stepped up right behind her, her voice colder than usual.
You have no right to treat it like that.
The man shrugged, sneering.
It's mine. I can do whatever I want with it.
Amanda pressed her lips together, then took out her wallet.
How much?
The man narrowed his eyes, then smirked.
$20.
Amanda sighed, but still handed him the money. The vendor roughly yanked the chain, removed it, and pushed Midnight toward them. But Midnight didn't move. It jerked back, panicked, its eyes full of doubt, as if it couldn't believe it was truly being set free. Lena bent down, gently reaching out.
It's okay, Midnight.
Her voice was soft as a promise. Midnight stood still, its eyes wavering. The girl patiently waited. Then, after a moment of hesitation, Midnight took a small step toward her. Lena smiled, reaching out to gently stroke its dirty fur. Amanda let out a soft breath, realizing her daughter had made the right choice. She unhooked the old chain, tossing it aside. For the first time in its life, Midnight was free. Lena led Midnight along, slowly but steadily.
Let's go home.
And Midnight followed the girl, for the first time without fear. Midnight wasn't always the fearful and withdrawn dog it was now. There was a time when it had been happy. Midnight was rescued from a shelter when it was small. At that time, it was just a skinny puppy, its eyes full of fear, but still maintaining a bit of curiosity about the world. It was David, a gentle, middle-aged man who lived alone in the suburbs, who took Midnight away from that place.
We're going home, little one.
David smiled softly, gently stroking Midnight's shaggy fur. In the days that followed, Midnight gradually got used to its new life. David lived in a small, warm house with a garden full of greenery. Every morning, he and Midnight walked along the peaceful village road, letting his four-legged boy run among the trees, smell the damp earth, and chase after falling yellow leaves. In the afternoons, they played fetch in the yard. David would laugh whenever Midnight clumsily missed the ball, then happily brought it back with its tail wagging wildly. At night, Midnight would lie beside David on the sofa, its heavy head resting on his lap, enjoying the warm caresses. To Midnight, David was its whole world. But then one stormy night, Midnight's world completely collapsed. That day they went for a walk later than usual. David forgot to bring an umbrella, but he just laughed when the rain started to fall.
We'll run home quickly, Midnight.
He said, patting the dog's head gently, then starting to walk on the empty road. But Midnight didn't like the rain. The feeling of cold water running through its fur made it shiver. Then a piercing sound tore through the night. The screech of brakes rang out shrilly. A truck had lost control and was speeding toward them, its headlights blinding in the rain. David only had time to turn his head. In a horrifying moment, he used all his strength to push Midnight away. Midnight tumbled onto the roadside, its paws slipping on the wet mud. The sound of metal crashing rang out deafeningly. The truck threw David onto the road, then slid for a distance before stopping. The rain continued to fall. Midnight barked frantically, running to David's side. But he no longer responded. It licked his face, rubbed its head against his hand, trying to wake him up, but David remained motionless. Midnight's eyes widened, its breathing rapid. It didn't understand what was happening at all. People shouted, someone called an ambulance. Sirens echoed in the night, red lights flashing illuminated David's still face. Midnight was held back by a paramedic. It howled, struggling, trying to rush to its owner. But David could no longer hear Midnight. And then, when the ambulance took David away, Midnight was left behind, alone. Midnight had sat there, in the rain for hours, its eyes following the direction David had been taken. It didn't understand why he wasn't coming back. No one came to pick up Midnight. No one told it that David would never return. A week later, a kind neighbor found Midnight wandering near David's house, its eyes empty, no longer wagging its tail as before. She took Midnight to a rescue shelter, but in Midnight's heart, that place wasn't home. It no longer cared about eating or playing with other dogs. Whenever it heard the sound of a car passing by, Midnight would tremble, ears flattened, huddling in a corner. The memories of the screeching brakes, of David lying motionless on the road, always haunted it. The shelter staff tried to find Midnight a new home, but everyone shook their heads when they saw it was too shy, too fearful. And then, one day it was sold to a man at the market, someone who didn't care about it. Midnight once had a home, a lush garden where it could run freely every morning, a warm sofa where it could curl up at the feet of its loving owner. But all of that was now just distant memories, faded like a beautiful dream torn into pieces. Now Midnight only had a rusty chain and a cold corner of the market, where it was tied tightly to a rotting wooden post. It didn't know how long it had been there. In the beginning, it was still panicked, still struggled, still barked weakly whenever it saw someone passing by, hoping someone would recognize it, stop and take it home. But then, when no one responded, when eyes just passed over it with absolute indifference, when footsteps trampled on the dirty ground without anyone looking back, Midnight began to understand a painful truth. Nobody cared about it. People came to the market with their own purposes. Some rushed to buy food. Others stood chatting noisily by the stalls. Some children chirped, asking their parents to buy them a small treat. No one stopped to look at a skinny dog with empty and desperate eyes, left behind like an old item that no one needed anymore. Every day it quietly lay down, curling up in the small shadow that the chain allowed, trying to shrink its body as if wanting to disappear completely. No one called its name in a warm voice anymore. No one gently stroked its fur. No more deep sleep under a safe roof. Only the noisy calls of vendors, the chaotic sounds of the market, the sound of knives pounding hard on the meat counter, people laughing and talking, and the stench of rotten food scattered on the ground. Midnight no longer tried to bark. It no longer resisted when pulled by the rough chain, nor did it hope that one day someone would come and save it from the darkness. It had learned one thing: a useless dog doesn't deserve to be loved. But then one day, among the unfamiliar faces, among the bustling crowd passing by without anyone caring, Midnight sensed a different gaze. It wasn't the indifferent look or superficial pity it had become accustomed to, nor was it the annoyed glance of the man who had dragged it through the dirty streets. That gaze was warm, gentle, but above all, that gaze was full of compassion. Midnight slightly raised its head, looking at the small girl with big, round eyes, bright under the afternoon sun. The girl stood silently, observing it with an expression that Midnight couldn't explain. It didn't know what had made the girl stop in front of it, among hundreds of people hurrying past. It also didn't know why, in a world that had abandoned it, there was still someone who looked at it as if it deserved to be loved. The girl knelt down, carefully extending her hand, not rushing, not forcing. Midnight blinked, its body tense. The girl's hand stopped in front of its face, gently opening, like a wordless invitation. Midnight wanted to back away. In its mind, a voice echoed, "Don't trust humans anymore. Don't trust them. Everyone just leaves you anyway." But Midnight didn't immediately back away. It still sat there, its eyes wavering, feeling the warmth from the small hand in front of it. Some part, deep in its hardened heart, wanted to trust, but the fear was too great. It had once been loved and then lost everything. How could it believe that this time would be different? Midnight lowered its head further, but still looked at the girl as if waiting for something. Perhaps it was just waiting to see if the girl would leave when she got nothing from it, like everyone else had done. But Lena didn't leave. The girl still sat there, her hands still open, still waiting for it, still patient in a strange way. And Midnight didn't know that its life was about to change forever. Lena gently led Midnight to the car, carefully keeping the leash loose, not wanting to make Midnight feel controlled or forced. She knew it needed time to feel safe. Midnight, although having somewhat accepted Lena, hesitated when stepping onto the car step, its paws trembling, eyes panicked. In its mind, the image of an ambulance with flashing lights appeared hauntingly. It remembered that rainy night, remembered the screeching brakes in despair, remembered how David's body fell before its eyes. The shouting sounds, the echoing sirens, all returned like a fierce wave, making Midnight shudder, curl up, its legs twitching as if wanting to run away. Lena looked down, seeing Midnight's tense body, its rapid breathing. She didn't pull the leash, didn't urge, but just sat down beside it, her small hands gently rubbing its dirty fur.
It's okay, Midnight.
She whispered, her voice gentle as a light breeze.
We're just going home.
Midnight trembled slightly, but still didn't step forward.
Midnight, you'll be fine.
She whispered, her voice as soft as passing wind.
I won't leave you.
Midnight didn't fully understand what the girl said, but it sensed the sincerity. Lena patted the back seat gently, then got into the car first, showing Midnight that there was nothing to fear. Midnight trembled slightly, but still didn't step forward. Lena looked up at her mother, eyes pleading. Amanda nodded, then opened the car door a bit wider, so Midnight could see the entire space inside, not feeling forced or trapped.
Let it decide on its own, Lena.
Amanda said gently.
If it's ready, it will step in by itself.
Lena nodded, then turned back to look at Midnight. She didn't urge it anymore, simply sat still, patting the empty space beside her, waiting. 1 second. 2 seconds. Midnight took a breath, its dark eyes wavering. Then very slowly it stepped one paw in, then another. Its entire body was tense, but when Lena gently placed her hand on its back, Midnight finally gathered the courage to step into the car. It didn't sit down, just pressed itself against the corner, ears flattened, alert eyes looking out the window. Lena gently stroked it, her small hands bringing a strange warmth. Midnight didn't know what awaited ahead, but for the first time, it wasn't completely alone anymore. When the car stopped, Midnight startled, thinking it would be abandoned again. But instead of being roughly pulled out of the car, it felt a warm hand taking the leash, gently coaxing.
Midnight, we've arrived.
Lena smiled, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Midnight sniffed the air, detecting the smell of soap, lavender, and dog treats, all vastly different from the dirty market where it had been imprisoned for so many days. Amanda opened the car door, stepped out first, then gently patted the seat, signaling for Midnight to come down. It hesitated, but when Lena gently pulled the leash, it reluctantly jumped down, still keeping its head lowered, eyes full of caution. Before it was a large shop with a sign reading, Happy Paws Pet Spa. Through the glass windows, Midnight saw other dogs being groomed, bathed in fragrant soap bubbles, and even sparkly collars displayed on the shelves. I'll translate the story for you following your requirements, maintaining accuracy with natural English, preserving paragraph structure, ensuring consistency in tone and word choice throughout, with no additional mini titles. This was not the place for it. Midnight cowered, but Lena wouldn't let go. The little girl knelt down, looking straight into Midnight's eyes, her voice as gentle as a promise.
We're going to help you feel better, Midnight. I won't let anyone hurt you anymore.
Midnight looked at the little girl for a long time, then relaxed slightly. Amanda led it inside where the spa employee, a young woman with a gentle smile, bent down to greet Midnight.
Well, this little one needs some special care.
She smiled.
But don't worry, we'll make him look handsome.
Midnight didn't understand what she said, but when gentle hands touched its fur, it no longer flinched as before. The bath was not easy. At first, Midnight tensed up, frightened when water touched its dirty fur. But as Lena sat beside it, giggling whenever soap bubbles covered Midnight's body, it gradually relaxed. The soap suds swirled, washing away layers of dirt and months of suffering. The once soiled jet-black fur, after being washed, revealed a glossy black coat soft as velvet. Its cracked claws were neatly trimmed, and its dark eyes now shone a little brighter, as if it had just been cleansed from the shadows of the past. Midnight looked at itself in the mirror, but it no longer recognized the dog before its eyes. After Midnight was clean and fragrant, Amanda and Lena took it to the pet store. For the first time in its life, Midnight saw a place full of colors, with shelves displaying items it had never before thought were meant for it. Lena excitedly chose a soft brown leather collar, a plush bed, a shiny new food bowl. Midnight, which one do you like? The girl smiled, holding up a warm sweater with a small moon embroidered on it. Midnight just looked up at the girl, not knowing how to react. It had never owned anything of its own. It wasn't used to being cared for, looked after. But when Lena gently placed the collar around its neck, then tightened it just enough, not tight, not uncomfortable, Midnight felt something new. This feeling wasn't like the heavy chain at the market. It was no longer a dog in bondage. It was Midnight. And for the first time in its life, it truly had a family. The car rolled slowly down the small tree-lined street. The surroundings gradually became quieter, without the noisy vendor calls, without the chaotic sounds of the crowded market. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of green grass after a light rain. Everything too peaceful, too different from the place Midnight had grown accustomed to. When the car stopped in front of a charming, small house with a spacious garden, Lena opened the car door, but Midnight didn't jump out immediately. It just stood still, four paws firmly planted on the car floor, ears flattened, eyes filled with caution. It wasn't used to this peace. It once had a home, but then it had lost everything. Lena understood that Midnight wasn't ready yet. She didn't pull the leash, didn't pressure it, just sat down beside it and whispered, "Midnight, you're safe now. This is your home." Midnight looked at the girl, its eyes still doubtful. But then slowly it lowered its head, sniffing the ground, as if checking if this place was truly safe. After some hesitation, it stepped down, but instead of running and jumping to explore like other dogs when arriving at a new place, Midnight just stood still, eyes observing every corner, legs slightly bent, as if ready to run away at any moment. Amanda stepped forward, gently opening the front door. "Come in, Midnight," she said, her voice soft but warm. But Midnight didn't move. It stood motionless at the doorstep, eyes wide open, breathing rapidly. A part of it wanted to believe this place was safe, but another part remained vigilant, still afraid that if it entered, that door would close forever, and it would be trapped, abandoned once again. Lena looked at Midnight, then turned to her mother, her eyes filled with worry. Amanda smiled softly, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Just leave the door open," she whispered. "Let it come in when it's ready." Lena nodded, then stepped inside first, sitting down on the carpet, not calling Midnight, not pressuring it. Midnight observed the girl for a long time, then looked at the door again. It had once trusted humans, and then had lost everything. How could it be certain that this time would be different? But Lena's gaze remained patient, waiting. Midnight swallowed hard, then slowly stepped inside, one step at a time, full of hesitation. But instead of running and jumping to explore like a happy dog, it huddled in a corner of the house, silently observing everything around with a wary gaze. The first days in the new home were not easy for Midnight. During the day, it still kept its distance from everything, not daring to approach anyone except Lena. At night, when the whole household had fallen asleep, Midnight remained awake, curled up in a corner of the room, its eyes gleaming in the darkness, its ears always perked up, listening for the slightest sound. Whenever a car drove by outside, Midnight startled, its four legs tensing as if ready to run away. Old memories flooded back like a ghost that wouldn't let it go. The screech of brakes in the night, the cold rain falling on its back, the image of David lying motionless on the wet road. Whenever these sounds echoed in its mind, Midnight would whimper softly, curling up tighter, as if it could shield itself from the painful memories. It hated those sounds, not because they were unpleasant, but because they reminded it of something it had lost forever. One afternoon when Daniel, Lena's father, accidentally closed the door a bit too forcefully, a bang resonated throughout the room. Immediately, Midnight jumped up, rushing straight into a corner, its whole body trembling. It pressed its back against the wall, breathing heavily, eyes wide open in panic, as if suddenly pulled back into the past. Daniel froze, looking at Midnight with astonished eyes. He hadn't meant to frighten Midnight, but its reaction wasn't like that of a normal dog. Midnight looked at him, but not with the eyes of an animal seeking safety from its owner. It looked at him as if seeing a ghost from the past, something that could hurt it at any moment. Daniel took a step back, whispering, "It's afraid of its past." Amanda stood beside him, silently observing everything. She gently squeezed her hand, then turned to her husband, her voice carrying a deep sadness. "This isn't just a dog that was abandoned. It lost the most important person in its life." Midnight had a new roof over its head, but it still didn't truly feel this was its home. It was still afraid, still cautious, still carrying wounds from the past that time couldn't easily erase. But there was one difference this time. For the first time in a long while, Midnight had someone willing to wait for it. Lena didn't give up. Every day, the girl still patiently sat beside it, not forcing, not rushing. Every night, when Midnight startled awake from nightmares, Lena gently comforted it, whispering, "It's okay, Midnight. You're not alone anymore." Midnight still didn't fully trust, but for the first time in a long while, it felt a small ray of hope creeping into its heart. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe it would have a real home again. Midnight still had a long way to go to overcome its past, but one thing was certain: Lena would always be by its side. Although Midnight had gradually adapted to its new life at Lena's home, it still wasn't truly a normal dog. It never wagged its tail when called, didn't eagerly rush to the door when Lena returned from school like other dogs. It didn't like being touched, nor did it voluntarily approach anyone except Lena. But even with the little girl, its contact was limited to a certain degree. During the day, it always kept its distance from everyone in the house, silently watching them from a hidden corner. At night, when the house fell into sleep, Midnight didn't sleep with Lena on the bed. nor did it curl up on the warm cushion the girl had bought specially for it. Instead, it lay close to a wall corner, eyes wide open in the darkness, ears perked up, as if it always had to be ready to flee at any moment. Whenever a truck passed by outside, the engine roaring, bringing back old memories, Midnight would start, its fur standing on end, its breathing becoming rapid. Lena had woken up many times in the night to find Midnight sitting there, motionless, its gaze empty, as if it were still trapped in a painful past. This worried Lena even more. The little girl loved Midnight with all her heart, but she also knew that love alone wasn't enough. Midnight had been hurt too deeply, and no matter how patient Lena was, she still didn't know how to help it truly feel safe. Lena had tried not to cry in front of her parents, but one evening, when Midnight whimpered softly in a sleep full of nightmares, she couldn't hold back anymore. "I don't know what to do to make Midnight trust me, Mom," Lena whispered, her voice choked, eyes red. Amanda gently rubbed her daughter's back, softly whispering, "You don't have to do this alone, Lena." And then the next morning, Amanda called Dr. Ethan Carter, a renowned animal behavior specialist in the area. Lena was still worried, but in her heart flickered a ray of hope. Could someone help Midnight overcome its old traumas? Dr. Ethan Carter was a middle-aged man with kind eyes. His patient gaze made Lena feel a little more at ease. When he entered the house, Midnight immediately withdrew into a corner, silently observing him with cautious eyes. It didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't attack like other abused dogs. It just remained silent. But that silence spoke volumes. Dr. Carter didn't approach Midnight right away. He didn't bend down to comfort it, didn't try to lure it with food like others had done. He simply sat down on the floor, maintaining a safe distance, silently observing. Midnight didn't take its eyes off him, but this time its ears drooped slightly, its breathing slowed, as if wondering whether this man posed a threat or not. After a long while, Dr. Carter finally spoke, his voice deep, warm, and calm. "Midnight isn't just afraid of strangers. It's afraid of emotions." Lena frowned, listening to every word he said. It once had someone who loved it, someone it considered its whole world. But then it lost that person. Not just a shock, it was pain. Midnight learned that if it gives away its feelings, it will lose everything. He looked at Midnight for a long time, then continued, "Now it doesn't know whether to trust again or not." Those words made Lena feel a deep sadness welling up inside her. The little girl bit her lip hard, slowly turning to Midnight. She had always wondered why Midnight never actively approached her, why it always kept a distance, why it had never truly relied on anyone. Now she understood. Midnight wasn't just afraid of being abandoned. It was afraid of loving someone again. From that day on, Lena no longer tried to quickly close the gap between herself and Midnight. She didn't call Midnight to come closer, didn't reach out when it wasn't ready, didn't force it to love her immediately. Instead, she just sat beside it, read stories to it, talked to it like a friend, or simply stayed silent next to it, letting Midnight decide when it wanted to come closer. She was so patient that sometimes even Amanda was amazed. At first, Midnight still kept its distance, but gradually it began to pay more attention to Lena. It didn't immediately trust, but it had started observing the girl more carefully, sometimes even tilting its head slightly when she told a story. Progress was very slow, but Lena never gave up. One afternoon, Lena was playing with a small rubber ball in the garden. She didn't expect Midnight to join, but deliberately played near it, so that if Midnight wanted to, it could freely approach. She rolled the ball slowly across the grass. Midnight watched but didn't move. The next day when Lena rolled the ball again, Midnight still just sat there, but its ears twitched slightly, its eyes following the ball longer than the day before. A week later, when Lena rolled the ball once more, Midnight suddenly stood up. Lena held her breath, eyes wide, her heart pounding. Midnight took one step toward the ball, then another. Finally, it gently lowered its head, picked up the ball, then brought it over and placed it in front of Lena. The girl's eyes widened, her heart almost bursting with happiness. Amanda and Daniel watched from the window. They looked at each other, smiling with relief. They knew that Midnight had just done something incredibly important. It had trusted again. Midnight still had a long way to go, but it no longer walked alone. Lena would always be by its side, patiently waiting, always loving it, however long it took to fully trust again. And Midnight knew one thing for certain: this time, it wouldn't be abandoned again. The sun gradually descended toward the horizon, spreading its final rays on the lush green grass in the small garden. The sunset cast a warm orange hue over everything, making the space unusually gentle and still. Lena and Midnight were playing together, the little girl's clear laughter ringing out, blending with the gentle breezes passing by. Midnight had changed a lot. It was no longer the trembling dog in a dark corner, no longer the creature that always backed away when someone reached out to touch it. Now it knew how to wag its tail, knew how to chase after the ball Lena threw, knew how to feel the simple joy of a normal life, though somewhere in its eyes there still remained faint traces of the past. Lena knelt down, wrapping her arms around Midnight as it brought the ball back. "Well done, you really did it, Midnight." Midnight looked at Lena, its eyes no longer as dark as before. In that moment, it seemed to have forgotten the lonely days, forgotten the fear that had followed it like a shadow. But a moment can change everything. A small, dark shape suddenly darted across the lawn, running as fast as an arrow through that peaceful space. A stray cat. It was panicked, eyes wide with fear, its small form racing as if fleeing from something. Midnight startled, its ears perking up reflexively. Then instinct rose within it. It chased after the cat. Lena had no time to react. The leash was still wrapped around the little girl's wrist, and when Midnight suddenly bolted, the pull was so strong that Lena lost her balance. The girl was dragged along behind Midnight, her small feet trying to hold back, but unable to counter the strength of a dog much larger than herself. "Midnight!" "Stop!" Lena shouted, but Midnight didn't hear. It had been swept up in its hunting instinct, not realizing that the leash was still tightly wrapped around Lena's wrist, not realizing that the girl was being dragged right behind it. Lena's small hand flailed, trying to find a way to remove the leash, but it was too late. Both had rushed onto the street. From inside the house, Amanda saw everything, and her heart seemed to stop. "Lena! Come back right now!" she shouted, her voice so frantic it shattered. But Lena couldn't hear anything anymore. She only saw that Midnight was still racing ahead. The small cat had escaped, but Midnight still wouldn't stop. Then, a bright headlight swept across the road. An engine roared through the quiet afternoon air. Lena turned her head, and she saw it, the truck. It was coming toward them. Midnight was still running. But then, something in the air changed. Amanda's scream, the sound of Lena's footsteps, the burning smell of tires as they skidded on the road. All suddenly crashed into Midnight's mind like a storm. It froze, breathing rapidly. It turned around, and at that exact moment, it saw Lena. The little girl stood in the middle of the road, eyes wide with horror, the leash still wrapped around her hand, and the truck approaching at an uncontrollable speed. The sunset sky suddenly plunged into an ashen gray. In Midnight's head, a familiar scene appeared. It remembered that fateful rainy night, remembered David, remembered the screech of brakes, remembered how his body fell, remembered how it had howled helplessly, trying to pull him up. But David no longer responded. It couldn't save him. It had been powerless. It had lost everything. Now, once again, someone it loved faced danger. Lena. Midnight tensed its entire body. It was afraid. It wanted to run away. The ghost of the past seemed to bind it tightly, pulling it back to the pain of old. But then, Midnight looked into Lena's eyes, and it realized something. This time it could change everything. This time, it wouldn't let that happen again. This time, it would save Lena. Midnight sprang up, channeling all its strength into its legs. It raced back, with everything it had, with all the faith and courage it never thought it possessed. Midnight ran straight toward Lena, faster than it had ever run in its entire life. When just steps away from the girl, Midnight leaped up, slamming hard into Lena, pushing her off the road. Lena fell safely onto the grass, but Midnight, it was still on the road. The screeching of brakes pierced the air. Lena held her breath, her heart seemingly stopped. Dust swirled everywhere. Lena opened her eyes, frantically searching for Midnight in the hazy smoke. Then she saw him. Midnight stood right in front of her, breathing heavily but not backing away. He wasn't running away. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had overcome the ghosts of his past, had found again the courage he had once lost. And above all, he had chosen to protect Lena, chosen to stay, chosen to face danger instead of fleeing. Lena sobbed, rushing to embrace Midnight tightly. Amanda and Daniel ran over, speechless. They knew that, from this moment, Midnight was no longer an abandoned dog. He had become a true protector, and he had found his home. In the days after Midnight saved Lena from the truck accident, his life turned a new page. No longer a dog cowering in darkness, no longer haunted by dreams that pulled him back to that fateful rainy night years ago. Midnight had learned to trust, learned that he had a family, had a place to belong, had a little girl willing to love him despite everything. Everything seemed to be becoming perfect. Lena and Midnight had a new routine, afternoon walks around the neighborhood. The little girl loved striding along tree-lined streets with Midnight, enjoying the fresh air and those rare peaceful moments. Midnight, though still somewhat cautious about the outside world, could now walk with a more confident posture, no longer showing the timid demeanor of before. The two walked silently along the stone-paved sidewalk, quietly enjoying the peaceful moment, until a piercing sound tore through their newly formed sense of security. Vroom! From a distance, the roar of a large motorcycle engine ripped through the gentle afternoon atmosphere. Midnight froze instantly, ears standing upright, body tensing as if he had just been thrust into an old nightmare. Lena started, turning her head to locate the source of the sound. And then, a black motorcycle sped toward them at high speed, suddenly slowed down and stopped right in front of them. The man on the bike turned off the engine and stepped down. He removed his sunglasses, spat on the ground, his cold eyes sweeping over Midnight, then stopping at Lena. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine. Even before seeing his face clearly, she knew who he was. Midnight recognized him too. He stood frozen, breathing heavily, his eyes darkening as if the darkness of the past had suddenly descended. This man was the one who had once tortured him, the one who had tied him to a rotting wooden post, starved him, beaten him, and finally sold him off like a useless piece of merchandise. He had abandoned Midnight, and now he had returned. The man smirked, lifting his helmet off his head, revealing a gaunt face with narrow eyes full of malice. "So you're still alive, huh?" His voice was hoarse, tinged with surprise and bitter contempt. Midnight growled, not the weak whimper of a frightened dog, but a low, threatening, angry sound. Lena tightened her grip on the leash, feeling Midnight's strong heartbeat under her hand. He stepped forward, eyes narrowed as he looked Midnight up and down. "You've really become a good dog. Looking healthier now, aren't you?" Lena felt her stomach tighten upon hearing his calculating tone. He didn't care if Midnight was living well. He only saw an opportunity to make money. "This girl has been taking good care of you," he said, licking his lips. "I bet you're worth several times more than when I sold you." Lena took a deep breath, gripping the leash even tighter. "Midnight doesn't belong to you," she said, her voice trembling but determined. He laughed derisively, his eyes contemptuous. "A dog belongs to its owner. I have legal papers. I'm just coming to take back what's mine." Midnight growled again, using his body to shield Lena. He smirked. "This girl seems to care a lot about you, huh? Let me tell you, Midnight, don't believe you'll always have a decent home. These people will abandon you sooner or later. You're just a dog. Dogs are just property to be sold when I see fit." Those words were like a knife stabbing into Midnight's mind. Old memories flooded back. His words echoed in his head. "You're useless. You're just a stray dog no one needs. You don't deserve a home. Not this time." Midnight clenched his teeth, his eyes flashing with determination. He was no longer the weak dog of the past. Before the man could take another step, a cold voice rang out from behind. "Stay away from my daughter." Amanda and Daniel appeared at the walkway, their eyes filled with anger. Amanda quickly approached, tightly embracing Lena, pulling her close. Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself between Lena and the man. He raised an eyebrow but showed no sign of intimidation. "Who are you people?" he sneered. Daniel didn't respond immediately, but his gaze was unyielding. "Midnight belongs to our family. You have no rights over him." He laughed coldly, folding his arms across his chest. "My papers say otherwise." Amanda pulled out her phone, holding it up to his face. "And here's evidence that you abandoned Midnight, abused him, and deliberately sold him without legal registration. If you take one more step, I'll call the police immediately." The smile vanished from his face. He narrowed his eyes, lips pressed into a tight line. A heavy silence descended. Midnight still stood there, breathing strongly, eyes never leaving the man who had once tortured him. Then he reluctantly backed away, glaring at Midnight one last time. "Enjoy while you can, Midnight. You think they'll always keep you? You'll see. No one can be lucky and safe around an unlucky black dog like you." He got on his bike, started the engine, which roared ferociously once more. Then he sped away, leaving behind a cloud of smoke and a chill in the air. "No one can be lucky and safe around an unlucky black dog like you." Those words resonated, sharp and cold like a blade cutting into Midnight's mind, leaving an invisible but aching wound. He had gone. The roaring engine sound of the motorcycle had faded into the distance, but what he left behind remained. Midnight stood motionless, his legs seemingly anchored to the ground, his eyes darkened, empty. Not out of fear, but out of doubt. Was he right? Was what Midnight had just a temporary illusion? Could he really have a permanent home? Or would everything be taken away again, like before? Midnight felt a coldness enveloping him, even though the sky was still bathed in warm sunset light. Even as Lena wrapped her arms around Midnight, whispering to him that everything would be all right, Midnight couldn't escape the darkness surrounding him. The man's words still clung to him, gnawing at his mind like a parasite. Midnight didn't know what to feel. He wanted to believe what Lena said, the sincerity in her eyes, Amanda's gentle hand squeeze, Daniel's resolve as he stood blocking the man. But was it enough? Could they last forever? Midnight had once trusted in a home, in an owner who loved him, and then everything disappeared in an instant. He had once trusted humans, and then humans had betrayed him. So was this time really different? Midnight closed his eyes, but the darkness couldn't obscure the doubt tormenting his mind. Could happiness exist forever? Or was everything he had just a beautiful illusion, waiting to be shattered? Midnight didn't know the answer, but he feared he was about to lose everything once again. That evening, Amanda and Daniel exchanged worried glances as they saw Lena silently bowing her head, occasionally glancing toward the door, where Midnight was still huddled in the corner. "Midnight still hasn't eaten?" Daniel asked, his voice dropping. Lena nodded slightly, her eyes filled with anxiety. "He doesn't eat, doesn't run around, doesn't wag his tail anymore," she whispered, her voice choked. It's like he doesn't want to be here anymore." Amanda placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder, squeezing gently to reassure her. "Midnight doesn't not want to be here, my love," she said. "He just doesn't yet dare to believe he deserves this happiness." Daniel sighed, his eyes pensive. That man stirred up Midnight's greatest fear, the fear that one day he'll be abandoned again. Those words made Lena's heart ache even more. She remembered what the man had said. "No one can be lucky and safe around an unlucky black dog like you." He had tried to plant doubt in Midnight's heart, and he had succeeded. Lena clenched her fists. She couldn't let Midnight continue to drown in this fear. In the days that followed, Lena and her family did everything they could to help Midnight feel that he truly belonged here. Lena didn't pressure Midnight to be happy right away, but she always stayed by his side whether he responded or not. She still read books aloud every night, still sat on the rug near Midnight, still let her small hand gently touch his soft fur as a reminder that she would always be here. Daniel took care of Midnight's small kennel in the garden, adding another warm blanket that he liked. Amanda searched for dog-friendly recipes, making Midnight's favorite foods by hand, doing everything to help him feel safe. But Midnight still hesitated, still afraid, still uncertain. And then, one morning Amanda set down the food bowl as usual. But this time, Midnight lowered his head, took a deep breath, and slowly ate each bite. Amanda smiled slightly with relief, feeling as if a large stone had just been lifted from her chest. Lena ran into the house, hugging Midnight tightly. "You ate! You ate, Midnight." For the first time in many days, Midnight wagged his tail slightly. Not much, but enough for Lena to see a ray of hope. In the following days, Midnight began to move around the house more actively, no longer lying in one corner. Then one afternoon, when Lena was playing ball in the garden, Midnight approached and sat down right beside her. Lena held her breath, looking at Midnight with expectant eyes. Midnight looked at her, then lowered his head, gently pushing the ball forward with his nose. He no longer doubted. No one could guarantee happiness would last forever. But he knew that, right now, he truly had a family willing to fight for him, and that was the most important thing. Lena's heart tightened, but this time from emotion. She hugged Midnight tightly, tears silently flowing. "You'll never be abandoned again, Midnight." Amanda and Daniel stood not far away, witnessing the scene. Amanda smiled slightly, her eyes shining with joy mixed with relief. Daniel put his arm around his wife, saying softly, "He's found his answer." That evening, Lena sat down beside Midnight again, but this time Midnight was no longer silent. He slowly rested his head on her lap, for the first time actively seeking comfort. Lena smiled, wrapping her arms around him. "Midnight, you know what?" she whispered. "It doesn't matter what happened in the past. It doesn't matter what he said. You're not an unlucky dog. You're my family, and I will never abandon you." Midnight closed his eyes, breathing out a sigh of relief. For the first time in many days, he felt true peace. Perhaps happiness isn't something that exists forever, but if there was somewhere Midnight could call home, it was here, beside Lena and her family. Lena, Amanda, Daniel. They had proven they weren't people who would abandon him. They had fought for him, and now Midnight wouldn't let the ghosts of his past steal the happiness he had just found. This happiness wasn't a brief dream. It was real. For the first time, Midnight dared to believe that, and he would never let himself doubt it again. In the months after confronting his former owner, Midnight had truly changed. He was no longer the frightened dog, trembling and hiding in the shadows. He had learned to trust, to step out of his painful past, and most importantly, he had realized that he had a real home, a family that would never abandon him. But that didn't mean Midnight's journey was over. One day, while sitting on the front porch, Lena gently stroked Midnight's fur, her eyes reflecting thoughtfulness. "Midnight, you know what?" she spoke, her voice soft but filled with determination. "I want the whole world to know that you're not just an abandoned dog, you're a brave dog. I want people to see how strong you are." Midnight looked up at Lena, his ears tilting slightly to one side, as if pondering what she had just said. At that moment, Daniel came out, holding a colored printed paper. "I found something that you and Midnight might like," he said, handing the paper to Lena. The girl curiously looked down. It was a skills competition for rescue and recovery dogs, an event to honor dogs who had overcome trauma and found faith in their new lives. Daniel sat down beside his daughter, his gaze gentle yet firm. "This isn't an ordinary competition, Lena," he said. "It's a place for dogs like Midnight, dogs that have been hurt but have found new hope." Lena pressed her lips together, her eyes brightening with this idea. "Can we participate, Dad?" Daniel nodded. "If Midnight is ready?" Lena turned to Midnight, her eyes full of anticipation. "Would you like to try?" Midnight looked at the girl, then at the paper in her hand. For a moment, a hesitation flashed in its eyes, but then it gently nuzzled Lena's hand, its tail wagging slightly. For the first time, Midnight confidently stepped out of its own shadow. In the days that followed, the whole family helped Midnight prepare for the competition. Amanda and Daniel helped Lena research the necessary skills, from jumping over obstacles, running on command, to psychological recovery exercises. At first, Midnight was still hesitant. When Lena threw an object for it to retrieve, Midnight would only watch without moving, as if still afraid of doing something wrong. But Lena didn't give up. The girl patiently sat beside Midnight, encouraging it bit by bit. "It's okay, Midnight. You don't have to be perfect right away. I'll always be here waiting for you." Gradually, Midnight began to respond. It ran faster, jumped more accurately, and most importantly, it dared to trust itself. Lena and Midnight practiced every day. When the sun rose, they ran together in the garden. When dusk fell, Midnight lay beside Lena, silently listening as she read books. Midnight no longer doubted. It knew it truly had a family. The day of the competition finally arrived. Midnight stood beside Lena on the competition field, its eyes still showing a hint of worry. But when Lena bent down to stroke it, Midnight felt calmer. "You can do it, Midnight," Lena whispered. When the whistle blew, Midnight darted forward faster than ever before. It jumped over barriers, crawled through tunnels, climbed up wooden steps, each movement strong and precise. When it reached the final obstacle, a high jump ring, Midnight paused for a second, remembering the injuries from its past. Lena held her breath, her heart tightening as she saw Midnight standing still. But then, Midnight looked up, seeing Lena's eyes full of trust. And it jumped. The entire stadium erupted in applause. Midnight had done it. It hadn't just passed the test, but had surpassed itself. After the competition, the family returned home. The night sky was clear, stars twinkling and reflecting in the window. Lena and Midnight sat by the windowsill, silently gazing at the vast sky. Lena wrapped her arms around Midnight, the warmth from its body making her feel strangely peaceful. "Midnight, you're not a lonely dog anymore," she whispered, her eyes shining with endless love. "You have a family, a real home." Midnight gently closed its eyes, nuzzling against Lena's shoulder, its tail wagging softly. For the first time since the accident, Midnight no longer doubted. It felt safe. It felt like it belonged. And for the first time in many years, Midnight truly slept peacefully in the arms of the one it loved most. Midnight's journey from an abandoned dog, carrying the pain of the past, to finding a real family is not just a story about the courage of a small animal, but also evidence of the miracle of love. Lena didn't just save Midnight from a cruel fate, but also helped it learn to trust humans again, helped it understand that a real home isn't a place people come to when needed, but a place where no matter what happens, one is always loved. And Midnight, from a dog carrying the wounds of the past, stood up bravely, faced its fears, and finally shone with its own abilities, becoming a symbol of hope and recovery. What about you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a healing journey, whether of a person or an animal, that moved you? Please share your story in the comments. If you enjoyed this inspiring story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful videos. Thank you for watching. See you in the next wonderful stories.